after the Oklahoma City bombing, for the first few hours, we were given a whole raft of people. It was the Iranians, it was the Saudis, it was Osama bin Laden, blah, 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 blah. Nobody said it was going to be a homegrown American. Maybe some people came up with the idea, assuming that that is exactly, it comes out to be the truth, that it was a couple of people from Chechnya, born in, or from Dagestan, or from Kyrgyzstan. But I did hear on the radio somebody yesterday saying this could very well have been the Iranians. Well, I happen to think that was dumb, only because I don't think the Iranians are that dumb to do something like that. But I can tell you, if it had been brought home to the Iranians, or somebody would have said that, any idea about having any negotiation with Iran would be dead, and the bombs would start falling. We are on that kind of hair trigger, and we have an industry here now, in the United States media, and to a great extent in the Congress and others, who are prepared to seize upon certain kinds of events since 9/11 and point to their particular enemy and then work on that basis. That is a problem for our society, and it doesn't look like it's going to get better anytime soon. Incidentally, if they were indeed from Chechnya, they would have been, if they were Muslim, they would have been Sunnis, not Shia. A distinction in this country that is not well known, and I guess there's some really black humor with regard to that. I'm delighted to be with our two candidates here. Not two candidates, I'm sorry, we're in candidate, two colleagues here with their very extensive experience. I have to tell at least a couple of anecdotes of my own. Back in 1978, a colleague of mine, I was in charge of Middle East affairs in the White House. My colleague Gary Sick was in charge of Iranian affairs. Fortunately, he had to deal with the hostage crisis, and I got to deal with the simple things like Arab-Israeli peacemaking. We were authorized by the President of the United States to offer the ambassadorship of the United States to Iran. And we went out and offered it to this man, and he pondered about it, and he says, I don't think I'll do it. And as a result, Bill Miller did not become a hostage, but was free to stay in the United States. One of his smarter decisions. I went to, last time I was in Iran, I have to say, I haven't been invited since, but maybe there's a reason for that. I was in 1975 with Ted Kennedy, and we spent 1 hour and 47 minutes with the Shah. I think it was the longest meeting he'd ever had with a foreigner. We came out of that, and Kennedy says to me, he said, you know, this guy's got a lot of money. How come his suit looked like it was falling off him? And I said the following thing, and didn't follow up what I said. Oh, I don't know. Looks like a guy who's on chemotherapy. Oh! 5 years later, when we discovered, just as he was dying, that was true, we learned that his French doctors knew about it all along, but hadn't bothered telling us. French are always very good allies. I happen to think that's true. Incidentally, talking about death to this and death to that, borrowing from the Persians, we do that. Anybody who's a chess player here does it all the time. Death to, checkmate, death to the Shah, right? That's what checkmate means. Okay, we're asked to talk today a little bit about U.S.-Iran direct talks as a breakthrough on the horizon. I hope that Bill Miller's right. I fear that he's wrong. Not because we don't have a basis, a framework, things to talk about, series of common interests, ways to make this work, but because the political climate, in my judgment, simply does not allow it. I'll give you another thing. I've worked on Arab-Israeli affairs now for 45 years with some of the same people. Lauren Bacall's first cousin, for example, is president of Israel. That's Shimon Peres. You didn't know that, did you? Small world. Okay, well, he was in the game when I first started 45 years ago. There is a solution to Arab-Israeli peacemaking. It is called the Clinton Parameters of the 10th of January, 2001. Everybody who's honest, who knows anything about Arab-Israeli peacemaking, knows that that's the answer. So we've known it for 12 years. What prevents it from happening? Politics. Politics in Israel, politics among the Palestinians, and politics in this country. If you allow the Israelis and the Palestinians to get together, all the polling says they would agree on the Clinton parameters in 24 hours, and we'd have it done. Well, that's what's happening now, I'm afraid, with us with regard to Iran. We got a mess. And let's understand just how much of a mess we are in. In Iran, I haven't been, as I said, since 1975, but the people of Iran are suffering. No question about it. Not so much the leaders, but the average Iranian. It is a society that is highly isolated. The opportunities of this extraordinary society, our president says it, other people say it, etc., this extraordinary society to take its proper place in the world is stunted. The opportunity of people to go about their business and to fulfill their destiny as human beings is stunted. We've already heard that the largest group of outside students in this country up until 1979 were Iranian. Today, incidentally, they're Chinese, so maybe there's a story there too, unless we get ourselves into a real catfight with the Chinese. The Iranians are very much suffering. The United States, we're in a mess too. Let me just give it to you very simply. The President of the United States has made a commitment. Incidentally, if the President of the United States had been a Republican, he made a similar commitment. Both of these candidates were blackmailed during the election. I'm sorry, let's use the term, and they both caved into it, to say not only are all options on the table, incidentally, not all options are on the table. That is, we have not been prepared as a country to negotiate seriously, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But on the military side, the President of the United States, it's Mr. Obama, could have been Mr. Romney, has said that if X, Y, or Z comes about, some kind of red line, which is not defined very clearly. In fact, Mr. Netanyahu even said that that caricature he had at the UN has now been kind of pushed up a little bit, in part because they have to understand in Israel that a war with Iran would be a disaster for Israel, just as it would be probably worse for us than the Iraq War has proved to be for us, from which we have still not recovered in the Middle East and with our alliances. I won't say that we and Iran are both self-deterred, but there is certainly an element of that in that. But the President of the United States has said that under certain kind of circumstances, he'd be prepared to use force. Now, this means the United States is in the following position, that the President is dependent on not having to follow that scenario, which I personally believe would be bad for the United States. We can judge that. There have been a lot of people who've had their own views on it. I happen to think it would be very bad. The President thinks it would be bad. The Joint Chiefs of Staff think it would be bad. Between them, they have so far managed to keep us from going over that particular line. But keeping from going over that line is dependent upon two things. One, Israel behaves itself. Two, Iran behaves itself. No great power should ever get itself into that position. It is, I won't say hair trigger, because I think there are a lot of sensible people on both sides who don't want this to happen and all of this, but it is not a salubrious position in which to be. And I think this is a mess, we got to find a way to get out of it. Number one, I think what we have to understand in this country is we're not going to be able to disengage from the Middle East. We are sick and tired of war as people in this country. We had some people, idiot people, talk about a war of choice in Afghanistan. Sure, doing what we did, we all felt after 9/11 what we had to do. I worked at the time in a place called the Rand Corporation, and I looked out my window and I could see a plane slamming into the Pentagon. We're the first building south of that. In fact, I used to say I had a very unique position, very important position. I had oversight of the Pentagon. I literally had oversight of the Pentagon. Don't anymore. I now work someplace else. All right, we went into Afghanistan, and then at Tora Bora, we didn't get Osama bin Laden, and we have spent $1 trillion or $2 trillion in Afghanistan. There's not a war of choice. We could have stopped at that point. Then we went into Iraq, and one of the dumbest things we've done in our history. Maybe there was not joining the League of Nations was stupider. I don't know, but certainly invading Iraq was another thing that cost us an incredible amount of money, and we've lost about 6,000 lives. On top of which, we killed more than 100,000 Iraqis. On top of that, we don't want another war out there, but we can't disengage. We're stuck with it. We have a lot of interests out there. We're going to produce more hydrocarbons in this country. We're going to have fracking. We're going to have a Keystone pipeline, whatever it is. We might actually become exporters. Stop. All of our friends and allies in Europe and elsewhere are going to continue to be dependent on hydrocarbons from the Middle East, and that's our economy too. So that's a pipe dream, the idea we're going to be able to get out. We also have, let's face it, a special relationship with Israel, which goes very deep in this country. It's not just something for Jews or for evangelical Christians. It is something that's very deep in our society. So anybody who's worried about that, get over it. That's part of the American culture, and let's move from there. We also are now facing a thing called Arab Spring, whatever that is. But it does mean that the capacity of dealing with things like terrorism, things like of kinds of instability, the refugee and immigration flow into Europe, et cetera, what happens in Egypt, or what happens in the Egyptian-Israeli relationship, what happens in Syria, with the risk now of a spread of a Sunni-Shia civil war in Syria across the Middle East. We have now a creeping civil war that is not something that's actually coming out of Iran particularly. The Iranian Revolution, to a great extent, has run its course. They tried to export the revolution, then people said, I don't want to live like that. It's also almost, I think Bill Miller was saying, really coming out the other side, but a lot of these others haven't. Now I'm going to say something that will get me in deep trouble, which is the leading exporter of terrorism in the world is not Iran, it's Saudi Arabia. Not the government, but all these rich guys who are like producing the Salafis and the whatever they're called, and have been killing Americans in great numbers. In Pakistan, in Afghanistan. It all comes out of Saudi Arabia. Now, it's not just a coincidence that 19 of the 20 bombers in this city happen to be Saudis. Well, we don't even talk about that. Well, you now have in Syria people saying, by God, you've now got the Al-Qaeda working in Syria. Surprise, surprise. Well, we're going to be stuck there for a long time, and lots of folks are looking us to do that. We don't need, therefore, this conflict with Iran if we can get out of it. Now, I'm going to part company with a lot of people. I don't think the nuclear thing is the big part of the issue, the biggest part of the issue. Could we live with an Iranian bomb? I don't want to live with it. And I can think of 100 reasons why not, but if need be, we probably could. The idea that the Iranians are going to be nuts, or frankly that Kim, whatever the guy's name is now, is nuts, and they're going to start popping nuclear weapons all over and seeing their country incinerated. The use of a nuclear weapon by Iran would mean the incineration of people of Iran. They're not going to do that. That's dumb. And I hope they're smart enough not even to cross somebody's red line. I think I could sit down as a trained nuclear strategist, and there are 2 or 3 others in this room, and meet with some Iranians, but you can't do it because we're Americans. But get some Swiss. Please, you people in Iran, get some Swiss. Get some others. Get the South Africans who had the weapon and gave them up. The Swedes who decided not to. And sit down and figure out it's a white elephant to have nuclear weapons, particularly in that part of the world, and the Iranians would regret it. Now, there's a counter-argument, which is Gaddafi came to that conclusion, gave up nuclear weapons, and he got killed. That's not a great object lesson if you want to keep the Iranians from getting the bomb, quite frankly, but that's something they have to work out. Oh, one other thing, before I turn to what we need to do, something the Iranians need to do. Get off this business with Israel. Iran has no standing in regard to the Palestinian issue. I know they say things like, if the Palestinians reach agreement X, we will live with it. But all this stuff about Israel's this, Israel's that, the Holocaust this, the Holocaust that, I can see that maybe that's just domestic politics. But by God, that is raising a red flag. And every time it happens, American politicians cannot move in the direction of trying to have a serious interchange with Iran. That is a fact. And until Iran decides, we're going to stop that. We're going to shut people up when they start doing that. Shut them up. Now I can understand they would say, oh, Israel should be wiped off the map. Well, you can say what they're saying is, let's go back to 1947, start with the 47 thing and have a referendum. Well, if I'm an Israeli that says, well, the referendum, we lose the referendum, we cease to exist as a state, that means wiped off the map. Okay. Get over it. Okay? Stop it. Now, just so that I don't look like I'm being nasty to the Iranians on that, there's some things we shouldn't do. We did something last week which is an extraordinarily stupid thing to have done. We permitted the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. Incidentally, today is the anniversary of Waco with the Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians looked like a Sunday school compared to the MEK. All right? The MEK came up with a huge amount of money, bought a lot of people, got themselves off the terror list. I don't know where the money came from. I'd really like to know where that money came from. Last week they opened an office in Washington with a stone's throw from the White House and some people who should have known better. Ted Kennedy's younger son, Patrick Kennedy. Jim Jones said, and Jim Jones shows up. Maybe he felt bad because on his watch, the Iraqis went in and killed a bunch of MEK people. He turned out and he said, these people share American values. This is a guy, he was National Security Advisor. He took $25,000 from the MEK, but I don't think, I'm sorry. There was a poll that came out yesterday of Iranian Americans. The only thing they agreed on, 95%, is the MEK are a bunch of swine who worked for Saddam Hussein in the war that killed 1 million Iranians, okay? That's really dumb on our part. Okay, we'll get rid of the MEK if you shut up, you Iranians who are in the room, shut up about Israel. Now, what do? I said that, and we're going to have a lot of discussion. First, we need to see this more broadly. We need to see what our interests are until some bitch who decided he wanted to make a name for himself, came up with a thing called the axis of evil. We know why he came up with it. Up until that moment, Iran and the United States had a common interest in Afghanistan. Why? It's not because the Iranians loved us. Just like when the Iranians impounded the Iraqi Air Force in 1980 during Desert Storm, it's not because they loved us, it's because we had a common enemy. The Iranians and we worked together. Jim Dobbins and other people say that. Axis of evil comes to an end. We have similar interests with Iran in regard to Afghanistan. We have certainly congruent interests with Iran in regard to drugs. The two countries that suffer most from drugs from Afghanistan are Russia and Iran. When I was in Afghanistan with Jim Jones, before he discovered the MEK a few years ago, the Iranians came to NATO and said, we are suffering from the drug trade. Please, NATO, put your troops on the Iranian frontier in Afghanistan. The United States vetoed it. We all know why the United States vetoed it. All right, that's another element, but we also in the process have to get control of this issue made back here in the United States. Because I'll tell you, Israel, if it were to go to war or lead us to go to war with Iran, wouldn't be doing itself any favor, as we hear from 4 of the last 6 or 7 heads of Mossad, and we hear from many of the most recent heads of the Israeli Defense Forces. We got to find a way to do that. We got to get the United States Congress out of this business. John Kerry at least went up there yesterday and said, pretty please, don't do so much on more sanctions. Let's face it, we and Iran are at war. Sanctions are an act of war. That's our side. The Iranians have done certain kinds of things, whether it's with Hezbollah or Hamas, or what they may or may have not have done in Iraq or in Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are acts of war on both sides. We ought to flip that around and start looking for acts of peace. And I'll give you some examples. Height of the Cold War, 1972, ABM Treaty. We created an incidents at sea agreement with the Soviet Union to prevent conflicts coming by a clash between our two navies. We and the Iranians, everybody has an interest in the free flow of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Everybody, including the Iranians. We have common interest on counter-piracy. The Iranians are involved in counter-piracy off the East Coast. Why don't we talk to them about it? Why don't we have why don't we have a free flow, a freedom of passage through the Strait of Hormuz, etc.? Now, I said something, we don't have all options on the table. What we need to do is the following couple of things. I'll just finish on these things. Number one, if you want to deal with another country and get them to do something, you got to walk in their shoes. The Iranians got to walk in our shoes, which means you got to understand the Israeli thing for us and stop throwing gasoline on that fire. Like it or not. We have to understand that 3 countries, we have to recognize the security interests of 3 countries, the United States, Israel, and Iran. We are unwilling, and have been in 3 administrations, unwilling to say that we will recognize that Iran has legitimate security interests. Begging your pardon, Bill, but the report that came out this week by the team that you were involved in doesn't say that either. It says maybe down the road it can be talked about. I remember talking to some of the EU negotiators a few years ago, and I made this point, and they said, oh no, we talked to the Iranians directly, and we said, we're prepared to have security, maybe even security guarantees. Question, are you speaking for the United States? Answer, no. Then you were not serious. Now, maybe that we can get a response, but if you're not prepared to say that, you're not even in the game. The Cold War with the Soviet Union came to an end for a number of reasons. One of which was after 1962 with mutual assured destruction, after 1972 with the ABM Treaty, we and the Russians became responsible for one another's ultimate security. That's what mutual assured destruction meant. Now, I don't think we were in that situation with Iran. They don't have mutual assured destruction against us, though they could cause us a lot of damage, and we could incinerate Iran if it came to that. We are in something of a mutual deterrent situation. Let's recognize it. Let's at least say security has to be an element. You know, if I were an Iranian, and I'm not, and I looked out at the world and I saw that I'm totally surrounded by nuclear powers. I have two countries, the most powerful country in the world and the second most powerful country in the world, that's a joke, the United States and Israel, have said, I will attack you under certain circumstances. What would I do? I'd get the bomb. The miracle is they haven't gotten the bomb. Well, let's start looking at broader things. Let's look at our overall interests and do a couple more things, and I'll shut up on this thing. Number one, the United States government finally has to understand that the Middle East all has to be seen as a unit interacting, and they have to hire people who understand that, get a first-class team of people. Maybe Mr. Kerry and Mr. Hagel are, but if you go and you look at the people running across the United States government in charge of Middle East affairs, you would be shocked at how many second-rate and third-rate people are doing that, and that includes the entire White House team. Speaking as an American, that is shocking. Well, that's the way we're going to get out of this mess, and we damn well better do it, because otherwise we're going to wake up one morning, there's going to be a war between Iran and somebody else, and we're going to say, why didn't we avoid it?
Well, thank you. I think the three presenters have been a little short of superb with their respective perspectives on this unique challenge, situation, moment in time that we have. Let's have some questions, and when you have a question, let's pick the individuals you'd like to.